I never thought my life would take such a sharp turn. I remember a time when everything felt stable, unshakable even. My wife Laura and I had been together for almost 12 years. We had our ups and downs, sure, but every couple does, right? Or so I thought. It was last fall when I started noticing subtle changes. At first, it was easy to dismiss. She'd been staying late at work more often, which I figured was just the usual year-end rush. She's a project manager at an advertising agency, and every year she's swamped with client deadlines around that time. I didn't question it, not until things started piling up in ways that didn't add up. We'd always been close, talking about our days over dinner, sharing little details, but she became guarded. She'd leave her phone face down, silencing notifications with an awkward chuckle, saying it was just work stuff. Then there was the distance, not just physically, but in every sense. Even when we were together, she felt miles away. She stopped laughing at my jokes, became less interested in the plans I'd suggest, and always had some excuse to keep us from spending quality time together. It felt like I was losing her, piece by piece. One evening, I decided to surprise her at work, hoping maybe she just needed a reminder that I was still here, still in love with her. But when I arrived, her coworkers told me she had left hours ago. They looked confused when I mentioned she'd been working late. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I drove around aimlessly, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to ask her, to confront her, but how could I? If I was wrong, I'd sound paranoid, insecure, but if I was right, I wasn't ready for what that might mean. For the next few weeks, I watched her. I know it sounds obsessive, but I felt like I had no choice. There were too many small, unsettling details I couldn't ignore. She'd come home later, sometimes with the faintest trace of cologne that wasn't mine. When I'd ask about her day, she'd be vague, saying she'd been meeting clients or handling agency issues. But her eyes, something was missing. Finally, on a chilly Friday night, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went through her phone. She'd left it unlocked on the counter, and before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself scrolling through her messages, my heart pounding in my chest. What I found wasn't explicit, but it was enough. There were messages from someone named Jay. Conversations filled with inside jokes, plans for lunches, even a few late-night chats where she'd talk about feeling free and excited. I could hardly breathe. The messages haunted me for days. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. It felt like my mind was stuck on repeat, going over every word, every emoji, every little hint that Laura had been pulling away from me while leaning closer to someone else. I didn't know who Jay was or how long this had been going on, but I knew I had to find out. On Monday, I couldn't focus at work. I was just going through the motions, counting down the minutes until I could go home and see her, maybe even get the nerve to confront her. But when I got home, she wasn't there. Laura had left a quick note on the counter, something about a work dinner with the new clients her agency had taken on. It was vague, like so many of her excuses had been lately. Instead of waiting, I decided to find out for myself what was really going on. I knew where her office was hosting the dinner, a small, high-end restaurant downtown that she'd mentioned a few times before. I figured if I could see her there, maybe catch her alone, I might get the chance to talk to her. Or maybe I'd see something that could give me answers without needing to ask. When I arrived at the restaurant, I parked across the street, hidden by a row of trees. My heart raced as I scanned the windows, looking for her. About 20 minutes later, I saw her walk in, but she wasn't alone. She was with him. There he was. Jay, I assumed. Tall, dark hair, wearing a well-fitted suit. He had that kind of confidence that made him seem larger than life, the kind that radiated and made everyone else fade into the background. Laura looked different with him. She was laughing, her eyes bright. Her face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. They didn't look like colleagues. They looked like a couple. And as I watched, he leaned in closer, whispering something in her ear that made her smile in a way she hadn't smiled with me in months. I sat there, frozen, as I watched them. They moved through the meal like they'd done this 100 times before. I felt like an outsider looking in on something I was never supposed to see. I wanted to burst through the doors, to confront her, to scream at both of them. But I stayed in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answered. Eventually, they left together, walking side by side out of the restaurant and down the street, lost in conversation, oblivious to the world around them. I couldn't bring myself to follow them. Instead, I just sat there, staring at the spot where they'd disappeared, wondering how everything had come to this. It was almost midnight when I finally drove home, numb and unsure of what to do next. When Laura came home later, she slipped into bed beside me without a word. I lay there, wide awake, feeling the bed sink as she settled in next to me. She smelled faintly of wine and that same cologne I'd caught before. I couldn't move, Couldn't even look at her. All I could do was lie there, thinking about everything I'd just witnessed. The next morning, I decided it was time to talk to her. No more waiting, no more second guessing. Whatever was going on between us, I had to face it head on. The morning felt different, thick with tension. Laura was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, casually sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone as if everything was normal. I stood there for a second, watching her, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the person I saw last night. My chest tightened. A mix of anger, hurt, and confusion swirling together. "Laura," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up, surprised by my tone. "Yeah?" "We need to talk." I could feel my throat tighten, my pulse racing. I had no idea where to start or how much to say. I only knew I couldn't hold this in any longer. Her expression shifted, a flicker of something. Was it guilt? She set her coffee down and nodded, pulling out a chair across from me at the kitchen table. "What's going on with us?" I asked. I could barely look at her, focusing instead on the small crack in the table, tracing its edge with my finger. "Lately, you've been different, distant, and I can't ignore it anymore." She looked away, her fingers fidgeting with her phone, her usual calm demeanor slipping. "It's just work stress, Jake. Things have been crazy, and I've been putting in more hours than usual. I didn't mean to make you feel like I was distant." Her voice was low, guarded, but she wouldn't look me in the eye. "Work, huh?" I let out a humorless laugh, my voice colder than I'd intended. "So that's what last night was? Work?" She froze, her face losing color. "What do you mean?" Her words were slow, cautious. "I went by the restaurant, Laura. I saw you with him." I swallowed, forcing down the bitterness rising in my throat. "The way you looked at him, that wasn't just work." I could feel my anger spilling over, no longer contained. She sat there, stunned, her face a mix of shock and shame. "Jake, it's not what you think." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Oh, really? So explain it to me." My words were sharp, and I could see them hit her like a slap. For a long moment she was silent, staring down at her hands. Finally she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "His name is Jason. He's someone I met at work. We've been spending a lot of time together, and yes, we got close. Closer than we should have." She looked up, her eyes meeting mine for the first time. "But it wasn't supposed to be anything serious, Jake. I was just, I don't know, lonely." "Lonely?" I repeated, the word stinging. "So you find someone else? Someone who just happens to make you feel a little more alive?" She reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine. "Jake, please. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was just a stupid mistake, one I regret." I pulled my hand back, feeling the anger surge through me. "A mistake? Laura, this wasn't some one-time thing. This is months of lying, sneaking around behind my back. You made choices every day to hide this from me. That's not a mistake. That's betrayal." Her face crumpled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I should have told you when I started feeling whatever I was feeling, but I didn't know how, and by the time I realized it was wrong, it was too late." I wanted to believe her. Part of me did. But the betrayal was too raw, too deep. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice cold and detached. She hesitated. "A few months, since the fall." My heart sank, remembering all those months of late nights, her changed demeanor, the times I'd tried to reach out to her only to be met with silence. "So what now, Laura?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where does this leave us?" She looked down, her fingers twisting nervously. "I don't know, Jake. I don't know if we can fix this, but I want to try. I don't want to lose you. I never wanted that." But I didn't respond, because deep down I wasn't sure if I could try. Days passed in a blur. Every time I looked at Laura, I felt like I was seeing a stranger. She was there, moving around the house, going through the motions of our life together, but everything felt off-kilter, broken. We tried to keep things civil, not for the sake of any kids, since we didn't have any, but just to avoid the screaming matches I felt bubbling up inside me whenever we were alone. I couldn't trust myself to stay calm. The anger was too raw. But one night, after another long, tense silence over dinner, I found myself staring at her, wondering how we'd ended up here. She looked worn out, guilty, barely touching her food. I could tell she'd been struggling, but a part of me couldn't sympathize. She'd done this. She'd let Jason into her life, knowing what it would do to us, and she'd still chosen him. "I need answers, Laura," I said, breaking the silence. My voice was firm, controlled. "You say you want to make this work, but I can't move forward until I understand. Until I know why this happened." She put down her fork, her hands trembling slightly. "I know, and you deserve that." She looked up, a sadness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. I felt like something was missing, Jake. We'd fallen into a routine, and somewhere along the way I lost myself. When I met Jason, it felt like a spark, something I hadn't felt in years. I felt the sting of her words, the implication that whatever she was missing, she hadn't found it with me. "So what? You needed someone else to feel alive? To feel valued?" Her eyes filled with tears. "It sounds terrible, I know. And maybe it was selfish, but I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I just wanted to feel something different. Something exciting." I swallowed hard, the bitterness thick in my throat. "Do you love him?" She hesitated, and the pause was like a knife twisting in my gut. "No," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't love him, Jake. I never loved him. It was just an escape." "An escape," I repeated, trying to wrap my mind around it. "So while I was here waiting up for you, trusting you, you were off with him, escaping?" I let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Do you even realize what that feels like?" She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I can only imagine, Jake, and I'll never be able to make it right, I know that. But if you can just give me a chance, I swear, I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her words and let them heal the wounds she'd left. But I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind, the one that kept whispering, "How can you trust her again?" But I realized that I needed more than just words to decide. "If you want this to work, Laura, you're going to have to cut him off completely. No contact, none." She nodded immediately, relief flooding her face. "Done. I'll delete his number, block him on everything." "You have my word, Jake. I want to rebuild what we had, more than anything." A part of me softened, seeing her willingness to try, to make amends. But I knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, and I wasn't sure if love alone would be enough to carry us through the damage. The following weeks were an emotional minefield. Laura cut all ties with Jason. I made sure of that, even went through her phone to confirm he was blocked on every platform. She accepted it without argument, doing everything she could to prove she was committed to repairing what was left of our marriage. She'd leave little notes around the house, words of apology, and promises to rebuild my trust. She was affectionate, attentive, even suggesting we go to counseling together. But no matter what she did, I felt hollow. The trust that had once bound us together was gone, and I couldn't shake the constant questions. Every time her phone buzzed, every time she was late from work, even by a few minutes, my mind spiraled into suspicion. It felt like I was a stranger in my own home, watching every move she made, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman I'd once known. One evening, I came home late after grabbing a drink with a few friends. I opened the door to find Laura sitting on the living room couch, staring down at her wedding ring, twisting it around her finger. She looked up when she heard me come in, her eyes tired, the sadness etched deep into her face. "Jake," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this." I dropped my keys on the counter, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily in the room. "What are you saying, Laura?" She sighed, her eyes brimming with tears. I thought if I tried hard enough, if I showed you how sorry I was, maybe you'd forgive me. Maybe we'd find a way back to what we had, but it feels like I'm only hurting you more by staying. I can see it in your eyes every time you look at me. You're holding on to so much pain, and I'm the one who put it there." I sat down across from her, exhausted, my heart heavy with the truth we both knew but hadn't said aloud. "You're right," I admitted, my voice shaky. "I don't know how to let it go. No matter how hard I try, I can't forget what you did. I can't stop seeing you with him every time I close my eyes." A tear rolled down her cheek and she quickly wiped it away, nodding. "I understand, Jake. I hate myself for what I did to us, for taking us down this path. But if letting go is the only way for you to heal, maybe it's what we have to do." We sat in silence, the reality settling between us. It felt surreal, like this wasn't how our story was supposed to end. And yet, it was the only ending that made sense. The next morning, we started discussing the logistics. Who would stay in the house, what we'd do with our shared finances, how we'd handled breaking the news to family and friends. We were calm, almost businesslike about it, and yet I could feel the sadness clinging to every word. It was like saying goodbye to a life we'd spent over a decade building together, one memory at a time. A week later, Laura packed her things and moved out. Watching her go was one of the hardest moments of my life. She paused at the door, her hand lingering on the handle, as if she might turn back, as if she wanted one last chance to say something that could change it all. But instead she just looked at me, her eyes full of the regret that couldn't change a thing. "I'll always love you, Jake. I just wish I'd never hurt you the way I did." With that, she was gone. The house was unbearably quiet after she left, the silence thick and unyielding. I wandered from the room to room, trying to make sense of a home that no longer felt like mine. Her absence was everywhere, and it hurt, but there was also a strange sense of relief, of knowing that the healing could finally begin. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. I threw myself into work, reconnected with friends, and started finding pieces of myself that had been buried under years of routine and complacency. Over time, the pain dulled, the memories faded, and I began to feel like myself again, or at least some new version of myself who would survive this storm. Years later, I ran into Laura at a mutual friend's wedding. She was there with a date. Someone who looked kind. Someone who made her laugh in that carefree way she'd once laughed with me. We exchanged polite smiles, shared a few words, and then went our separate ways. It was in that moment that I realized I'd finally let go. The anger, the resentment, they were just memories now. Remnants of a life that had shaped me, but no longer defined me. I knew I'd be okay. I'd learned to trust again, to love again, even if it meant taking things one day at a time. And as I watched her from across the room, I silently wished her well, knowing that maybe, just maybe, we'd both found the peace we'd been searching for all along.